Hi everybody, thank you for watching. I'm Molly Ireland, an assistant professor of psychology at Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas. We'll be talking about a paper that I wrote with my collaborators, Kate Niederhoffer, Jonathan Schler, and Gilad Gecht. And I will share my slides in a minute. Okay, so the title of our paper is Profiling Depression and Neutral Reddit Posts, Prediction, Insight, Trade-Offs, and Mental Health Technology Applications. And basically we analyzed neutral language use on Reddit, that is language use on Reddit that is not about mental health, in the hopes of categorizing posts as being either from a depressed person or a person who was presumed not depressed, a control Reddit user. And we framed this analysis with a consideration of the prediction insight dilemma that probably a lot of people attending this workshop are familiar with. So psychology, for the most part, traditionally has fallen on the side of insight, where they care more about theory and testing hypotheses that follow from psychological theories. Computer science, on the other hand, has traditionally fallen more on the side of prediction, where they care more about correctly classifying a text or a user than necessarily understanding what goes into that prediction. And this is especially of interest for mental health technology providers, such as clinical psychologists or people who work in industry for mental health technology, because there's an inherent tension in that area where you want to be able to predict a forthcoming mental health crisis, but you also want to be able to tell a client or a user of a mental health technology website why you are making a particular prediction. So if you're a therapist who's talking with a client one-on-one and you tell them our language-based model suggests that you have a crisis coming up, but you're not able to explain why that crisis might be happening, it's not much help to the client. People like to feel like they're in control of their mental health, and giving somebody that prediction without any background insight could actually make things worse rather than better and lead to self-fulfilling prophecies. So in this particular study, we looked at, as I said before, neutral Reddit posts, and we attempted to classify them as being from depressed or non-depressed people. I've done some similar research with a former graduate student, Micah Iserman, who just graduated from Texas Tech in December. And I think this is an interesting question, in part because it's a lot more challenging than just detecting differences between, for example, depression forums or anxiety forums on Reddit and neutral forums. That's relatively obvious and straightforward. People either are or aren't talking about mental health. But if you're looking at neutral posts and neutral forums, it is a lot more challenging. So two people, one depressed and one not depressed, talking about, for example, book recommendations, can language-based models tell the difference between those two users? So the sample in the study, and by the way, these were analyses conducted by Gilad Gecht and his graduate advisor, Jonathan Schler, so I will not be able to do them as much justice as Jonathan would be able to, but essentially they downloaded a decade's worth of a sample of Reddit posts from both depressed and non-depressed forums, and then they built a classifier for depressed versus non-depressed content on the basis of Ask Reddit and our Ask Reddit and our Depression as sort of prototypical forums for depressed and neutral Reddit content. And then on the basis of that classifier, they found additional neutral and depressed or depression relevant forums. And ultimately they collected neutral users who had never posted in depression forums for the final comparison sample. And the ultimate goal was, like I said a few minutes ago, to detect in posts that had nothing to do with mental health, so that weren't even necessarily about soul searching or negative life experiences, that didn't have anything to do with psychological distress or depression. In these posts, can we tell the difference between people who post regularly in depression forums and people who have never posted in depression forums? So as you can see from these tables, the Luke-based or more theory-based models did not perform as well as the models that were based on deep learning approaches, such as neural networks. So this is, in this table, this shows you the results from the convolutional neural network-based model, but that's just one example of several. All of the deep learning-based models outperformed the more theory-based models using Ingrams and Luke. And Luke, for those of you not familiar, is the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. It's a dictionary-based text analysis program that's been used a lot in psychology and in computational linguistics and computer scientists, or computer science. So what does this tell us? Well, one reason that the more opaque sort of deep learning based models outperformed Luke in this case could be because a lot of the research that has identified, for example, self-focus and negative emotional language as indicators of depression have been based on laboratory studies. So basically, when people are talking to a clinical psychologist about depression, when people are writing in a diary about depression, when they're talking to a loved one about depression, or about their everyday lives, they use these linguistic markers of depression, self-focus, and negative emotionality. You don't necessarily see that in neutral contexts in other psychology studies, and we didn't see that here. So the best performing models were relatively hard to interpret and may not provide information about the underlying mechanisms to, for example, mental health technology users or clients in clinical psychology or psychotherapy. So we would like to be able to use these models to tell people about their mental health, despite the fact that these models may not provide a lot of insight into the underlying mechanisms. There are better and worse ways to go about this. So if you explain this technology in common sense terms to the users, if users clearly opt in to sort of subjecting their everyday language use to these classifiers, they probably will not have negative consequences in terms of leading to self-fulfilling prophecies, or you can, to some degree, inoculate mental health technology users against those kinds of self-fulfilling prophecies by telling them sort of what these classifiers can and cannot tell them. From the perspective of an academic psychologist, I think that results like this are actually important because they tell us that our models of how depression manifests in everyday language use may be flawed when it comes to these neutral contexts where people aren't talking to loved ones, they're not talking to therapists, they're not talking about themselves or their own depression. And if it's the case that our theory-based predictors don't perform as well as machine learning models or convolutional neural networks, then that doesn't necessarily mean that we should give up. It means that we should start over or fine-tune our models and examine additional moderators that we haven't considered before, such as sort of finer-grained considerations of the social context in terms of what people are talking about and who they're talking to. Okay, so what does this mean for mental health technology? As an academic psychologist, I only have sort of peripheral awareness of what everyday life is for practitioners in mental health technology, people who create the websites and apps that people use to improve their mental health. But it seems that people can't consent to something that they don't fully understand. That's a common concern for academics when they're trying to handle informed consent and people who provide mental health technology through websites or apps. So basically the challenge is to explain sort of the margin of error in these methods and explain the algorithms that these methods use in ways that smart people who do not do this research will understand. The best case scenario is that people understand what they're consenting to and they use this technology in order to forecast their own mental health crises and get the help that they need when they need it. Ideally, this would be something that the practitioners, such as clinical psychologists or psychotherapists, and other mental health practitioners will be able to use this along with their clients in sort of a collaborative way that everybody understands equally. There are multiple worst case scenarios. People may not fully understand the technology. The technology could create the crises that it seeks to prevent, as we talked about before with self-fulfilling prophecies. And you could even argue that this kind of technology, taken to an extreme, could sort of coddle people and rob people of growth opportunities. So rob people of the opportunity to work through their own mental health crises on their own and sort of handle distress without the help of, you know, computers and experts. In the end, the ethics of this are complex, but if it's relatively easy to opt out, and if the informed consent process is relatively straightforward and explained in ways that people can understand fully without a computer science degree, then theoretically this technology can make people's lives significantly better rather than worse, and make mental health practitioners' jobs easier rather than harder. I look forward to discussing these issues that I've talked about here and more that are discussed in the paper that I didn't get a chance to talk about today in the more dynamic Q&A at the workshop itself. And I will see you later. If you have any questions, please email me or any of my collaborators at these email addresses. Thank you.